Good evening. In a much-trailed phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, it seems a number of issues were discussed, but a ceasefire with Ukraine remains to be agreed. The White House says good progress was made, and a Kremlin official even said the world had become a much safer place today. So what exactly was agreed in that 90-minute phone conversation? Well, Vladimir Putin ordered his forces not to attack energy infrastructure as part of a mutual 30-day limited agreement with Ukraine. They also discussed a potential maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea as part of that deal. Russia and Ukraine agreed to engage in a prisoner swap tomorrow, where each side would return 175 people. The Russian President Putin said he would also hand over 23 wounded Ukrainian servicemen as a gesture of goodwill. But the Russian president has a list of conditions, including that the West halts foreign military aid and intelligence information to Ukraine. Donald Trump also supported Vladimir Putin's idea to organise an ice hockey match between Russian and American players. Well, our US correspondent, James Matthews, is at the White House. But first, let's speak to our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett. Good evening, Ivor. So a limited ceasefire when it comes to energy and infrastructure, but really President Putin reaffirming those conditions.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. So they have, as you say, agreed some kind of ceasefire, but it's nowhere near the ceasefire that was initially discussed and what was principally the aim of this call. Donald Trump wanted Vladimir Putin to sign up to this immediate 30-day truce along the front lines, which Ukraine accepted this time last week. It's taken them this long to get down to it. But what we've got instead is a much lighter version, a ceasefire whereby Russia and Ukraine have both agreed not to strike one another's energy infrastructure. And we're told by the Kremlin that Vladimir Putin has given the necessary military order for that to happen. And I think that's because Vladimir Putin had a bit of a balancing act with this phone call. He didn't want to upset Donald Trump, of course. He didn't want to incur his wrath because Russia has a lot to gain from better relations with Washington. There is talk in the last month of potentially the US lifting sanctions on Russia, readmitting them to the G7 to make it the G8 again, a reset of relations. That is what Vladimir Putin wants. So he had to give him something. But at the same time, he wanted to emerge from this call with Russia's red lines still intact. He didn't want to give any ground on his maximalist positions. And it seems like he hasn't, because in the Kremlin's communique, there is quite a telling line, which is a bit of a refrain from Moscow. He said that, or the Kremlin said, the Russian president declared his readiness to thoroughly work out possible ways of settlement together with his American partners, which take into account the absolute need to eliminate the root causes of the crisis. That is a phrase we've heard a lot in the past week or so, because when Vladimir Putin talks about root causes, in his eyes, that is NATO's eastward expansion. It's essentially Kremlin code for saying that our security concerns need to be met, and for Ukraine never to join NATO. And I think he was probably also talking there about Russia's desire not to have any foreign troops there, any troops from NATO countries acting as peacekeepers. So it seems like Russia's red lines are intact. And the reason why Vladimir Putin is so reluctant to sign up to a straight ceasefire, of course, is because he feels he doesn't have to whilst they have the military advantage. The longer talks go on before a ceasefire, the more gains Russia makes, and particularly in Russia's Kursk region, where it seems like Ukraine's incursion there is all but over. I think Vladimir Putin is very keen to get that secured and get that wrapped up before there's any kind of pause in the fighting. So I'd say that the Kremlin would be very pleased with the outcome of this call.
Because in effect, Ivor, President Putin now has a little more room to carry on this war.
Yeah, I think so. There's room to manoeuvre, clearly. Yes, there's no strikes on military infrastructure, but the key thing right now, the key goal for Moscow is totally expelling the Ukrainian forces from the Kursk region. That was hugely embarrassing when that started at the beginning of August, that cross-border assault. It took the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin by surprise. And it's hugely embarrassing that it's gone on this long. Now that victory is in his sights there, he wants to kind of make Russia all Russian again. He doesn't want to let up. And he was in the Kursk region last week, dressed in military fatigues, as you can see. That was a very symbolic visit. And I think it really sent a message to Washington and Ukraine that he doesn't want to give up his military advantage, because he fears, of course, any pause in the fighting will allow the Ukrainians to rearm and regroup, and he fears he might lose that advantage. This is a way of giving himself that room to maneuver on the battlefield, and that could happen within days that the Ukrainian forces are completely expelled. So I'd say it's a bit of a fudge here, a ceasefire light, nowhere near the ceasefire that was initially touted and agreed last week with the Ukrainians and the US.
Ivor, thank you very much. Let's go to James Matthews in Washington. And James, I suppose what President Trump can claim is that things are progressing.
Yeah, and you know what? He can make these claims because the Russians have given him that opportunity. Look at the dressing around this deal, the hockey match between Russian players and American players. That will speak to Trump. He likes to talk sport. He likes to sell sport. And Americans, many in this country, care more about ice hockey, frankly, than they do about a war far away that they don't think affects them. The prisoner exchange, you can bet that Donald Trump will headline that as an achievement of his. So, you know, there is the dressing that allows Donald Trump to style himself as the artist of the deal, if you like. But I think he's been outboxed in this particular set of circumstances. If you look at the guts of this, I mean, key phrases jump out. Ivor talking there about the root causes and how Putin is ring-fencing what he sees as the root causes of all this. The root cause and the roots of this are that Putin thinks Ukraine belongs to Russia. Talk about the root causes. You talk about disarming Ukraine and essentially giving Putin the territorial advantage that he wants long term. So I can't see Ukraine agreeing to anything with regard to that. But more than that, there is the key line about American and presumably European assistance to Ukraine in terms of weapon supply and intelligence supply. Putin wants that to stop, a complete cessation he speaks about. So the scenario being presented by Putin is for Ukraine basically to stop having fresh weaponry, to do nothing, to be weakened during the period of any ceasefire, whilst, of course, at the same time, Russia can arm itself and rearm to the teeth, therefore strengthening its position during a ceasefire. And, of course, if the ceasefire results, if that breaks down, then you have a strengthened Putin, whilst Ukraine has been playing the gentleman's game and is left far weaker. So I think in Ukraine and in European capitals, they are looking at this through their fingers and praying that Donald Trump doesn't find a television camera anytime soon and say that is a deal worth signing, because I think that is a scenario whereby Europe and Ukraine have to turn to Donald Trump and say we simply cannot accept this. There are red lines drawn by Vladimir Putin through this agreement that are simply unacceptable to us. So I think we're at, there have been crisis points, have there not, throughout this whole episode. I think we've reached another one here.